Checking that's working. Kia ora tātou. Before beginning, I'd like to acknowledge the Honourable Michael Woodhouse for hosting this event. I enjoy that occasions I meet Michael on the plane, either coming back or going to Wellington. And we do have a few things in common. I'm not sure about the boyish good looks. You can claim those, I'm not sure I can. There are many distinguished people here, and there are many friends. It's lovely to see you all. I want to single out two people though before I begin, and Michael has foreshadowed this. We're lucky enough to have the founder of the study here tonight, and that's Dr. Phil Silver. Michael very accurately captured his seminal contribution to what has now been a juggernaut that's running for 40 plus years. Without Phil, this would not have happened. Phil could sell ice to the Eskimos, and that unique blend of skills was required in the early days. I mean, everyone knows about the Dunedin study now, or most people do, and they're hearing more about it on a very nice TV series that's up and running at the moment. In the early days, though, it was very tough, and Phil's maverick style is what allowed the study to get 10 years worth of data under its belt and then really start firing. So Phil, I take my hat off to you. There's a segment that I've selected from the 4-part documentary series on the study that's screening right now that I think pays due homage to Phil. There's also another person in the room who I want to acknowledge, and he's sitting behind Phil, and that's Professor Graham Fraser. He, a former chair of the Health Research Council that is celebrating 25 years of existence tonight. Graham was on the MRC, the forerunner to the HRC, the MRC committee that came down to Dunedin just under 40 years ago. And as a sociologist, it really fell to him to speak for or against this crazy notion that Phil Silver had about running a broad-based study of human health and development. Graham also, if you know him, is a very persuasive individual, and he obviously won the day way back then, and has been an ardent supporter of the study, but also me personally through the years, and I've greatly appreciated that. So, gentlemen, I acknowledge you. Thank you. So this title is meant to be slightly cryptic and interesting. It allows me to go in multiple directions. But I'm a genial fellow, so I'm going to go down a path that I think acknowledges what has gone before and then points to what we're currently doing, in particular emphasising work that I believe has contemporary relevance not just to the science world, this is the so what component, but also to the policy-making world, given that I believe greatly in the value of that, translation from science to policy, and also foreshadow where we might go in the future. I'll give you a very brief overview of the Dunedin study for those that don't know about it. Then I'm going to let the superb science bit be explained to you by others, for fear of me appearing immodest. I'll give you a 2-minute clip from the 4th program in the TV series, and then I'll take you through 4 areas of activity that I believe, I hope, reflect how we are not only relevant, but we're really on the cutting edge of a new wave and a new kind of sense of a value add, if I can put it that way. So the Dunedin study, 1,037 babies born, 1972, April 1st, it was founded on April 1st, Fool's Day, 1972, and ran for 12 months. There were 1,139 babies who were still resident, who were born in that year, still resident in the greater Dunedin metropolitan area 3 years later. They were all approached by Phil and his team and invited to participate in what was meant to be a short-term study, only 5 years. So Phil, you really messed up, mate. And I'm adding to the mess because we're still chugging on. We're in our 5th decade. The 1,037 people or families who said yes, they look no different from the people who said no. That was 91% of that birth cohort. They look no different in terms of perinatal characteristics and socio-demographic characteristics. So we think we've got a pretty good snapshot of that generation, early 70s Dunedin. As you'll see, they've been assessed, measured on all manner of things at multiple times as they've aged. From the earliest years at age 3, then every 2 years to 15. There's this bit of a spread in the time between assessments, 18, 21, 26, further spread, 32, 38, and we plan to, with HRC's support, begin to see our group again when they all reach the age of 45 starting next year. One of the things I'll draw your attention to is this right-hand column, and in particular, this figure down here. After 4 decades, we managed to see 95% of the living cohort. Now, if there was a Guinness Book of Science records, this would be in it. It won't probably surprise you to know that the major challenge to this type of research, following people through time, free living human beings, is what they call non-random loss to follow-up. In other words, the people that are hardest to find, hardest to recruit, get back in through time, are not a random group. Oh, if they only were. You just start with a huge number and let it whittle away through time. No sweat. But they're not. The people that are most difficult to find and get back in are an unusual group. These are people within whom multiple difficulties aggregate. They're the people that don't have a fixed abode. They don't have a cell phone. They're in and out of institutions. They might be on the run from the law. And most of these people are missing in the world's database about normal human development, except here. In other words, most of our knowledge about human development is based on the easiest to keep in group of 50 or 60% of people who, all other things being equal, are the highest functioning. So we've managed to keep everyone involved, which allows us to have confidence in our causal inferences. We believe that we've got a faithful representation of all the life exposures that are out there in the community, all the nasty stuff and the good stuff. And we've got a faithful representation of the range of possible outcomes associated with those nasty exposures. And we've got it in a general population sample. It's not a select group. It wasn't patients turning up to a clinic. It wasn't a sample of students. I mean, from those data, all you can do is generalize back to that group, patients or students. This is all walks of life. And it's the beauty and the power of the study, in part, that it's unselected. So we've managed to keep virtually everyone involved. Now, we as researchers get a lot of credit for that. But this is not the first time I'll say this tonight. But the real heroes are the study members. We have good systems, we work really hard, we have an attitude of working back from 100 instead of hoping for 60. A whole bunch of things are in play. But at the end of the day, it's the study members who make the effort. To give you a sense of the reservoir of goodwill that exists in this 1,000 odd people, there was a person at our most recent assessment phase who, when I wrote to them saying, yippee, phase 38's on, please come back, they sadly wrote back and said, I'm sorry, I'm dying of a brain tumour. However, if you're prepared to organise an assessment at a local hospital and allow my husband to come and support me, I want to give as much as I can before I pass on. I mean, that's very moving. It touches us as researchers. This is a very gritty, real-life project, and that testifies to that. So 95%. Now, as I said, it's pretty unheard of. In fact, overseas, when I present this sort of slide, people are aghast and they go, oh my God, how do they do that? That's not meant to be humanly possible. And literally one time when I was in America, I heard this, which is what? All right? Jaw hitting the desk. And I, over time, because I've spoken a bit at different places overseas, I've begun to imagine what people are thinking to explain that. Goes something like, Dunedin, right, never heard of it before, but it's at the bottom of the South Island, it's at the bottom, which is New Zealand, it's at the bottom of the world, and clearly nothing ever happens at that place.
And in fact, these study members, they sit around in between these assessments waiting to be re-enrolled because it's the high point of their life. It's the most exciting things that ever happened to them. And so I always quickly throw up the next slide, which is the location of our study members, and you'll know this as New Zealanders. Don't worry about the details. Just know that a quarter live outside New Zealand at 38. All right, about 2/3 of that 25% live in the West Island over here. And then you've got about 10% who live further afield. Can you imagine the logistic challenges of finding these people and getting them back to Dunedin for a full day's worth of assessment, 8.5 hours, where they're poked and prodded and asked 1,000 different things, and then getting them back home, all in one piece. It's a serious challenge. And of course, we have to do that, otherwise that high retention rate will drop. Right? So there's a method in everything we do, and we take a great deal of care to try and put ourselves in the shoes of our study members. The golden rule is something I've inherited from Phil. You know, treat study members as you would like to be treated yourself. And it means thinking as if you're in their shoes, such as at age 32, I just had a child. I hadn't had the child, but we had my son and I had Priyanka, and I knew what a stressful thing it was to be removed from this young bub. And so we basically gutted the staff tea room, made a creche, and hired someone from the local childcare centre to come in on Fridays. For people that were having children, wanted to bring their young ones to the unit, and they could see their child, their babies, at morning tea, afternoon tea, and at lunchtime. So we think very hard at every developmental point as to what's going on for people to try and make it as pleasant as possible. Phil founded this study as a multidisciplinary study. Now every funder worth their salt, looking at HRC board members, in the world these days wants to fund interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary research. That's because we know that things are connected. The brain talks to the immune system is reactive to the social environment. The gastro system is impacted upon by the immune system. Now, we didn't know that 40-something years ago. I think Phil almost had to coin the term multidisciplinary way back then. Now, this is what everyone wants to fund, and we've essentially got 40 years' worth of high-quality data in the bank. Doesn't that position us superbly? So again, thank you, Phil. You can see the range of stuff we do. That's a very busy slide. You're not meant to have busy slides, but that's busy in a disingenuous way to convey to you subliminally just how busy we are. We do stuff that ranges from the classic sociological to specialised programs of research, probably arguably the most detailed database on antisocial behaviour in the world. The person that leads that got the Stockholm Prize in 2007. That's the Nobel equivalent for criminology. We range from cognition, mental health, right out to the physical end of the spectrum. A whole bunch of physical outcomes are measured using gold standard assessment. We also take blood. Well, before we get to the blood, we've added to the main study. In early 2000s, we had a series of reviews in a run that said something like, "Whoa, what a wonderful study! It's a real shame they don't have a lot more information about the family of origin, given that family of origin via genes or via nurture or a bit of both can impact upon what you see in this generation." So in typical Dunedin study fashion, we just rolled up our sleeves and went back to the family of origin. So we interviewed the mums and dads, whether either at the same home if they were still together or different locations if they were apart, asked them about their health history in the broadest sense, asked them to report on their brothers and sisters and on their parents and on the siblings of the study members. So we have in family of origin, or liability, that's vulnerability to developing problems, 8,000 study members as a control variable. Then we started on the next generation. So we're measuring all the firstborn 3-year-olds in home. We visit their home, and now we've started a study of the 15-year-olds, all the 15-year-olds as they age in to that period. They are brought back to the Dunedin study unit, and they undergo pretty much what their parents went through 30 years ago, updated for current concerns like social media use and the like. That, by the way, is not a window on how things have changed across generations. You can't say, look at parents, this thing was prevalent, it's no longer prevalent in the next generation. We have a non-selected sample, that's the ideal in the main cohort. These children of the study members are incredibly selected. All right? What's valuable in the cross-generational approach, and a lot of people, even scientists, don't understand this, is that it's another window on mechanism. Because that's what longitudinal research is, using time as a window on mechanism to try and understand why things happen the way they do. This is the blood assay stuff. It enables a number of blood-based studies, modelling nature-nurture interplay, how the social world gets under, or psychological factors get under the skin to cause physical illness. You know, these hypotheses have been around for thousands of years. Psychosomatic hypotheses, nature-nurture discussion. We've addressed those issues in recent years as well. So, the next bit is a superb science. I hope.
The Dunedin longitudinal study has been going for over 40 years now. The study has grown in significance and impact. Researchers all over the world analyse its growing mountain of data. Founder of the study, Dr. Phil Silva, could scarcely have imagined the influence and importance the study would achieve when he launched it in 1972.
Very proud of the legacy. I think that the publications and the output and the influences on policy and the fact that we've got the most documented sample of human beings, large sample of human beings on the planet, that gives me a real sense of pride.
The study has published on average a new scientific paper every 2 weeks for 4 decades, and those papers are highly significant.
If I had a list of the publications these world-class scientists and scholars have generated, I could probably go on for hours.
It's probably the world's most successful longitudinal study of a general community sample ever.
It's an amazingly successful project, no question about it.
If you calculate the impact factor of the Dunedin study, it's probably the highest of any study of the behavioral sciences, and it's creeping up there in the medical sciences as well.
The study has made discoveries in virtually every area of human health and behaviour, including gene-by-environment interactions that cause violence, depression and schizophrenia, measurements in childhood that predict health and wealth in adult life, how to spot future criminals in kindergarten, and why teenagers run off the rails.
The Dunedin study is known in our field, in many fields, as just a hallmark and landmark study. I mean, just a brilliantly conceived study, and whoever came up with the idea should be really thanked. I mean, this is Nobel Prize winning stuff.
So, in lieu of a Nobel Prize, Phil, please stand up and take a bow. But just underline 3 bits that really make it quite special, this study. None by themselves do it, but we've got high retention, so we've got integrity in the cohort. What we have is breadth, so multiple aspects of human health and development are captured in the gold standard way. And then we have depth, which I haven't touched on to date. When we bring people back, they're in a lab situation effectively. We have the power of an epidemiological sampling frame, but we have lab-type control. And so they undergo a whole bunch of physiological tests that you wouldn't normally be able to do if you ring up people and ask them questions on the phone, or if you use postal questionnaires, for example, or you visit them in their home. So that gives us special abilities to get deep into what's going on for these folk, broadly, and we keep everyone involved. So it's that triumvirate that really makes us special. The 4 things I want to talk about. I'm going to start with something on childhood self-control, and I'm going to focus on that at the risk of repeating myself, because I gave a more in-depth talk on this a little while back at the ministry. But in the last 2 weeks, on the back of the TV series, a lot of people have begun to talk about this. And I'm approached by people in all sorts of situations telling me how much they enjoyed the series and how much they took out of it. In particular, this issue about childhood self-control. Concomitant with that, there's now real interest in several of the social sector ministries, in self-control as one of the key non-cognitive skills that you can teach children before they get to school that, as I'm about to show you, will have impacts that echo down through life. So let me lay the data out, make the point. So what is self-control? There's nothing mysterious about this. It's the ability to basically control your emotions, whatever they are, positive or negative, keep them in check, and then to focus on tasks or challenges that are before you, and to persist until you overcome, achieve your goal, or in Hillary's immortal words, knock the bastard off. All right? So this is how it looks in real life. You think before you speak. You don't act out. You resist doing or saying inappropriate things. It may be, just might be, that in the 21st century, self-control has never been more important. That's the case. All right? We live in high calorific, easy to access, high calorific food environments. Most of us engaged in work that is largely sedentary. Divorce is reasonably straightforward, if that's what's required or desired. There's lots of substances available, 24/7 TV and so on. You get the picture. So we, on the back of encouragement from Jim Heckman, the Nobel laureate that was featured in that short clip, decided to look at the long-term sequelae or the consequences of having different levels of this thing called self-control in childhood. We measured it multiple ways. The researchers among you will know that any particular approach to measurement has some error, and the way you deal with that error is you triangulate. So we had 4 sources of information that were assessed at age 3, 5, 7, 9 and 11. So multiple time points and multiple sources, a very robust composite measure of variation on this thing called childhood self-control. Those are the types of questions that were reported on by the various sources. Hope that makes sense in terms of how you would operationalize this idea of self-control. Then we related variation on that measure, and basically it was a normal distribution. So some people had a little bit of it, some people had medium levels of it, some people had a lot. As you would expect, it's just like height. You see natural variation, and it basically follows a bell curve. Then we looked at health outcomes. Is the level of self-control that you have in childhood able to predict how your health is in the 4th decade of life, the early 30s? And as I said earlier, we don't just ask people how you're feeling. You've been to the doc lately. The docs say you've got any problems. We directly assess it. So here's a submaximal fitness test. We don't do maximal because that will annoy people and they may not come back. So that's a submaximal test. These, by the way, are staff members. They're not study members. We'll die in the ditch to protect the study members' confidentiality. And that's because they have entrusted us with so much deeply personal information, and so that's an ironclad contract we have with them. So here's some stuff from the last assessment. Anthropometrics, that's something, I find it's a bit frightening to stand on one of these. It prints out your weight, but it also says how much of you is fat. So I won't be going anywhere near that next time round. Cardiovascular health, this is something measured, that's a fancy measure of endothelial function, which is the inner lining of your vessels. If you laid that out, it'd cover 7 tennis courts. Very important regulator of vascular health. Standard blood pressure approaches. There's some lung function measures we did where you get into a body plethysmograph and you huff and puff, and these manoeuvres are captured in a computer that sits alongside this, this machine. The dentist, he's a professor of public health dentistry, Murray Thompson. He comes across and physically examines the teeth, counts the number of teeth that are missing, counts the number of fillings. He does probes. You know that nasty thing they stick up your gum? He does that for gum disease. Then we take blood, of course, and do a whole bunch of assays. Now, for us, at age 32, there were a bunch of people that had 17% of the cohort who had metabolic abnormalities, 20% at 5th had gum disease, we had STIs, we had inflammatory markers. Systemic inflammation is a marker, a ubiquitous marker of poor physical health, and we had a bunch with respiratory problems. When we combined all that and said, what's the relationship with childhood self-control? This is what we saw. Now the way to read this graph, and I'll take you through the first one because it replicates in the next series of slides, is you have the whole sample divided into quintiles. That's 20% groups. Right? So this is the lowest level of childhood self-control, the bottom 20%, the next, to the highest level. And you can see this is a measure of poor physical health. And you can see that the people with the lowest level of childhood self-control at age 32 had by far the worst health. And there's a gradient. There's an association that's almost linear. In other words, that you never stop getting better health the higher up the self-control scale you go. Well, that's interesting. It wasn't just these people at the end. So that was physical health. Then we turned our attention to something that is of great interest from a policy perspective, substance abuse and dependence. You have to obtain that information by self-report. All right? Now, remember our people have been seen 13 times. They've never had a violation of their confidentiality. They trust us. So we tend to get pretty honest reports. However, we always do belt and braces in the Dunedin study. So what we have here is reports of other people that know our study members well. With their permission, we write to these people and say, does so-and-so have difficulties using substances, etc. So what we have then is the ability to, first of all, define via direct interview levels of substance dependence. These are the types of substance dependence we're looking at. Then we have corroboration by others. What's the pattern of findings against a background of different levels of childhood self-control? The red line, remember this is the low level, this is high self-control. The red line is likelihood of having a substance dependence problem. So all those dependence measures were brought together in a composite index, and it's highest by quite some for the low, and then you get this gradient. And it's the same if you go outside the person, just in case they're trying to put a favourable spin on themselves. We don't think they do, but just in case. So we've got that check built in, and that's the blue line, and it follows pretty much the same linear gradient. What about wealth? I mean, governments want people to save. The Retirement Commissioner does anyway, for the future. First of all, we looked at where people were at in terms of socioeconomic status and just income by age 32. What you see here is low self-control. You've got the lowest income and the lowest socioeconomic status. And again, pretty much a linear gradient. What about planning for the future? And by planning for the future, we're talking about attitudes and also outcomes. Do you own homes? Have you got any retirement plans? And so on. And surprise, surprise. It's getting familiar, right? Low self-control and then this linear association. This is just struggling. Self and informant reports. So we deal with that potential bias by just relying on our study member alone. Same pattern. Lowest self-control have the highest level of financial struggles and are rated as such by people that know them well. Crime, another important concern of governments. We have data from Australia and New Zealand, the police, about criminal convictions on our study members throughout their life. This is what it looks like in terms of childhood self-control. Percent with adult criminal convictions. So you've got early 40% at low self-control, and it's down to just over 10% at the higher end. But again, the gradient is still there for you to see. Parenting, another important social role. These are children with low self-control, this end, who had a single parent, had more single parent child rearing than those with a high level of self-control, and again you see this gradient. Perhaps more importantly, what you see in terms of ideal parenting, that's warm, sensitive, stimulating parenting, you see, this is here, and this was based on direct videotapes of the parent, study member, with their 3-year-old child at home. You see this gradient. In broad terms, this is poor parenting, better parenting. So, first thing you do once you see these associations, you try and make them go away, right? Because you don't want to go and publish and everyone, there's a bit of hoopla around it, and then to be found out to have made a mistake. In other words, the association's spurious, it's to do with some other factors. So because we get a lot of scrutiny these days, we really do knock our analyses around and desperately try and make them go away. So these analyses, those patterns were robust to adjustment for differences in socioeconomic background, differences in IQ, differences in sex, and differences in severity of symptoms at a disorder level, ADHD. That's pretty robust. What about economic measures? My minister's not here, Honourable Anne Tolley, but there's the difference based on childhood self-control in terms of the number of months receiving benefits up to age 32. So it's basically an 11-year period we started counting from. That's direct data from the ministry, so we linked that data. Almost 50 months versus 15. Huge cost differences involved. Now people, once we published this, made an interesting point. They said, okay, these people have got high self-control, but are they boring, uptight, you know, constricted individuals who are actually miserable? Fair enough, but you think about it. Look at those outcomes I just described. They're all pretty good outcomes. So if you're at the right end of the distribution for them, you should be happy, right? Well, it's true. Low self-control, not happy, whereas, or satisfied with how their life's trucking, versus those with higher levels are more so. What are the take-home messages for this? And so this is the bit where I say we're relevant to policy as well as to the science world. Well, one might consider that investing in interventions that were able to modify or inculcate higher levels of self-control among children at a young age, because they're more malleable or amenable to that, may have long-term benefits across multiple and costly domains for government. Crime, health, social benefits. They may be in a better shape when they're planning their future. And of course, you're improving the life chances of the next generation in terms of their parenting. We did adjust for adolescent factors as well as those other potential confounders, and the relationship remained the same. It seems clearly that starting early, focus on self-control, may net big returns. This is something many of you will be familiar with. It's a graph from Jim Heckman, the guy that won the Nobel Prize, and he talks about the importance of intervening early. If you were to draw a line through here, about where my red dot is, that's what economists, and I'm not one, would call opportunity cost of funds. In other words, if you took $100 and put it in the bank and it got interest, that's how much it would grow. Once you drop past early school years, your return on investment drops below this line. Right? So logic dictates you should intervene early. Right? Well, maybe not. I'll get to that next. Right, the gradient raises some interesting policy questions. Do you target or do you have universal? ECE is a wonderful vehicle. Universal, you could run some very important interventions about self-control in the ECE space. You'd probably want to get in earlier for those that need it the most. There are other vehicles out there, Plunkett, Wellchild, for example. You've got to start in utero, of course, for all this stuff. Antenatal classes in this country are a joke. You go to I remember ours, we went outside and there's several women out there smoking. There was no mention of that by our antenatal teacher. So there's a lot of lost opportunities just sitting there on a plate that we need to get our teeth stuck into. You really know it when the Muppets, not the Muppets, what are these people? Sesame Street. They're like the Muppets, aren't they? That really dates me, but there's Oscar and whatever. So Sesame Street, which is distributed throughout the world, picked this up. This is a direct result of that paper that came out in 2011. And so they are teaching kids self-control via saving. I put this up here for two purposes, to show the spread and the penetration out there into the real world, but also to illustrate a point, which is self-control can be taught relatively straightforwardly. Every time you interact with a child, there's an opportunity to either strengthen or not self-control skills. A simple game like Simon Says is an example of how one can strengthen self-control. There are a whole bunch of programs now out there, just get on Professor Google and you'll find them all, that are offering up approaches to build or strengthen self-control skills. And that's on the back of these types of studies that show how very important it is. The question is, does New Zealand want to tap into this? Other jurisdictions around the world do and are. And I believe now there's building a real appetite for exploring the possibilities in this country, which is fantastic. Now, remember I said early intervention. Is it really all it's cracked up to be? This is a paper that's currently under review. How much return can be expected if you devote your resources to those early years? The reason this question arises is because once you dig behind the hyperbole and the skiting and the carry-on that goes with many researchers about what a fantastic study they've got, you'll find an effect size that's essentially small. All right? The relationship between an early life exposure and an outcome way down the track is essentially small. I would immediately counter, of course, with, well, given it's over 30 years, that's pretty impressive. Okay, but that's me as a researcher. If I'm a politician or a policymaker, I've got to think, well, you know, I've got to make invidious choices between there or later or whatever. So it's an open question as to whether this is truly the right thing to do. Now this may cause some dissonance among you, because many of you have known me as a strong advocate for early investment, so I can give you a sense of where the punchline's going to be. But what did we do in this study? Essentially we took the social investment idea and subjected it to an empirical test. So, led superbly by Minister English, the government is thinking in terms of social investment, not costs. You don't probably realise how unusual that is in the world and how other similar jurisdictions are looking to New Zealand because of this. So having a bit of empirical data is probably quite helpful at this point. What did we do? We linked our depth, breadth and high retention data with the wonderful administrative data sets that are available in New Zealand. When we did that, we saw some interesting things. So that gives you a flavour of what it looks like after 40 years amongst 1,000 people. There was almost 25,000 months worth of social benefits paid out among our 1,000. Just under 9,000 bed nights in hospital. Almost 70,000 prescriptions. Just over 2,000 convictions, and so on. A lot of cigarettes. Interesting to think of it that way, isn't it? But beyond just interest, what I want to say here, and this is what drove this paper, is that we know that the distribution of these types of outcomes are not a bell curve. It's highly skewed. In other words, it tends to be a small group in the population that accounts for the lion's share of these bad outcomes. And we used an old-fashioned idea, the Pareto principle, and operationalised that notion in our cohort using this wonderful admin data that we linked. We basically said, are 20% of the people accounting for about 80% of the costs? Just going back. All right, these are the types of outcomes we're looking at. All right? When we asked that of the data, we essentially found that is in fact the case. In fact, 20% for each of those outcomes of the population will account for more than 80% for some things. This is just to give you one example using MSD data on benefits. So all this simply shows, forget all the gobbledygook here, is that 20% of our sample at this level had accounted for 80%, 81%, that's slightly misdrawn, 81% of the months drawing down money, benefit money. All right, now, that's interesting in and of itself. But we went a step further and said, these groups aren't independent. So we've got the 20% for hospital usage, for benefit use, for criminality and stuff. They overlap. And actually, there's a group of people, for the 8 outcomes we looked at, that tend to appear in a lot of these groups. And certainly you'll know if you talk to a SIFS worker that that's the case. These children are interacting with multiple agencies because they have multiple needs. This data is consistent with that idea. What we then asked was, well, given that the relationship between the 20%, the previous slide, and the outcome of interest, 20% predicting social benefit, that relationship was exactly as you would expect, small effect size. Maybe if we enrich our group of interest, that is the ultra high users of multiple services, we might get a stronger effect size. Essentially what we did was ask or define a group of ultra high users based on having 3 or more problems with obesity, smoking, use of hospitals, social benefits and so forth. So there were multiple users, 3 or more of those categories they appeared in. That made up 22% of our group. These are the rates of use. You can see it peaks up here at 81. Wasn't much going on for ACC. If you think about what that outcome is, that makes sense. That's accidents. If they're true accidents, it could happen to anyone. But they're overrepresented here. Now, what's interesting about this is once you take some of the known risk factors for ending up in these places, such as self-control, we also took IQ, social status, and child maltreatment, 4 robust risk predictors of bad life outcomes, threw them in together, and that accounted for a lot of the variation that we see. That predicted, I shouldn't say variation, that predicted membership of this group very powerfully. Let's put it that way. They weren't small effect sizes, it was powerful prediction. It was a big effect size. If you understand statistics, there's something called a ROC curve. It explained 0.87. Now that means 87% of the time you can get accurate classification into the risk group or the non-risk group. That's almost what is regarded as excellent. So we've moved from little effect sizes, albeit impressive over 30 years, to over 30 years, really high prediction. All right, so Minister English, get your checkbook ready. All right, now then we went another step, and this is the cool part. This is how you can marry admin data with in-depth data from life course studies. Then we asked, because our predictors were childhood maltreatment, social status, growing up in poverty, in other words, low IQ, low self-control, we measured those from birth through to age 11. No one in the real world is going to have all that data available to them, are they? It's just too hard. Then we said, what about something that could be done in the real world? So we went back to age 3, again, Phil, take a bow, and we had a 45-minute assessment of the children that covered a number of attributes, traits, abilities. A neuro exam, right? Is your posture right? How your reflex is working well. A vocab test, the ability to understand language, some motor skill testing, and we had this behavioural control measure thrown into that. This particular assessment, 45 minutes by a stranger at age 3, 35 years later, was able to predict those outcomes, all those negative outcomes, predict membership of that high risk group, that ultra high risk group. That's what we described as, or have described as neurocognitive status. So if you're not doing well in that space, you will account for a massively disproportionate share of the burden and the cost down the track. So the effect size there was 0.79. So Brian Perry, wake up Brian, will know that that's an incredibly high value. That's really strong prediction from 45 minutes and 35 years later. All right, so this, I believe, and I will risk sounding immodest, is our first in the world of this type where you combine and you go large, and you go down, and you go to detail, and you go early. This says the social investment model is right. I've had a couple of my science advisor colleagues read this, and they've rung me up effusive, because they get it immediately. It's been promulgated around the traps. My MSD boss, Brendan's got a copy. Some ministers have got a copy. So you can see that I'm quite active trying to get the research into a policy context to inform discussion. So I think that last rites on the Dunedin study, and I've heard some perform them in whispered tones behind my back, are premature. How else can we help? Well, there's a big process that was... How are we going time-wise? All right. So how else are we relevant to now? So some of you may know about this. There was a review of CIFS, the CIFS service, Children, Young Persons Family Service, for the most vulnerable children and families in New Zealand. And there was a panel that was set up. I was lucky enough to be a member of that panel. They produced a report that was quite far-ranging, far-sighted, made a number of recommendations for a radical overhaul of how this group of vulnerable people are supported, how the state responds to their needs. And fantastically, it's been pretty much supported by the government. So that's a tremendous outcome, and I think it has the potential to make an extraordinary difference for these most vulnerable New Zealanders. One of the things we learnt along the way is that getting a real handle on the complex nature of the needs of this group of people is not straightforward. There is data that exists in various places. It usually has a purpose other than describing in detail the complexity of the presentations. So it's for service, for informing service, or other things. So we weren't able to get a real good handle on either the outcomes associated with being enrolled in CIFS down the track beyond some pretty solid outcomes, I should say, things like benefit usages and criminality and time in prison and so forth. But there wasn't as broader set of outcomes as you would like. That's the nature of admin databases. They're great in terms of scale, but they're not great in terms of breadth or depth. You might sense where this is going. More importantly, for the next stages, okay, what do we do to make things better? We need to come up with a really good model of sophisticated state response to the variety of needs, very complex needs in some people. But we don't quite know what those needs are. So we can't really make the right choice about which intervention is going to be the most efficacious, can we? We can't for any longer continue just to say, near enough's good enough. It's not on. So I went back to the Dunedin study, and I got the Southern Region Chief Social Worker, who's also on the registration board, to come into the unit and to go through with one of my own staff, who's a social worker as well, and together rate based on qualitative information, not stuff that's coded and we use for our normal analyses, to rate that information, that qualitative information, notes taken about the children in the first 15 years of life, to rate whether they would be, in today's world, of concern to CIFS. I know what that looks like. I went to the call centre in South Auckland as part of the panel. So I had a look at what they came up with, and it looks right to me. In other words, they were able to come up with a group of about 10% of our sample who in today's world, with the rules of engagement as they are, would come to the notice of CIFS and be viewed as warranting further attention. So we have a proxy group. We're not going to publish this in a journal, but this will be what they call grey literature. We have a proxy group of 1,000 people, among whom 10% would probably qualify for CIFS today. And we can follow them through. As you can see, we've got all sorts of outcomes. And see how life turns out. And then more importantly, we can say, what do they look like in terms of their needs as children? So this is a busy slide, and I don't expect you to look at it. But the things we covered were a whole range of different economic outcomes, SES, income, benefit use, a whole bunch of mental health, high quality diagnoses through time, criminality, a whole bunch of physical health outcomes, health behaviours, oral health, cognition, premature ageing, which I'll get to towards the end of the talk, IPV, interpartner violence, social support, a whole bunch of things. All you can see over here is that there are values there that say that the people that were in our putative CIFS group were much more likely to have problems across these domains when they grew up. That's just confirming what we already knew from the admin data, but it's giving it a bit of breadth and depth. Then, interestingly, we say, what about as children? Now, Barry Milne, where's Barry? You hear Barry? Barry Milne from Compass helped with this in the last 48 hours. Basically took a bunch of childhood risk factors, and because it's so fresh, I've got to actually give you a flavour of what they are. So there's birth, infant risk factors for poor life outcomes, single parenting, teen mother, mother poor reader, low birth weight, smoking and pregnancy, short or no duration breastfeeding. There's a bunch of family risk factors, unemployment among the parents, mum and dad arrested, alcohol dependence, so on and so forth. There's a number of psychosocial risk factors, isolation, maltreatment, low IQ, number of health problems, obesity, asthma, tooth decay, chronic illness, and a number of mental health problems, hyperactivity, antisocial behaviour, depression in childhood that were all combined. All right? And what you see here, these are the children in the cis group, the 10%, and you can see that the majority of these children had heaps of problems across those 5 big domains with those specific indicators. What is this? It's 40-something%, this is 20, it's 2/3 are 8 or more of those problems. Part of why I did this was because I've been asserting that that's exactly what is the challenge. These kids are very complex. It's even more complex than that though, because you could have 2 kids with 9 problems each, or 9+ problems each, but they may be different problems. How do you respond to make their life better? This shotgun standard approach won't work. What say you have 2 kids, same problems, but some will be in the ascendancy of the 9. Some will really be playing a key role. Others will not. They'll be secondary. Whereas the other kid has a different constellation and pattern. So there's a new level of sophistication required if this new service is going to make a real difference. This begins to at least give people a sense of where the gold may lie. All right, we weren't going to publish this, but this is, in lieu of nothing else, this is how we can be helpful. Just to close on that, in terms of those broad domains, infant problems, family problems, psychosocial problems, health problems, and mental health problems, over half have deficits in 4 of the 5 domains. So it's the rule, it's normative to have multiple deficits. What a challenge. Finally, how are we relevant? Well, I've been sort of prattling on about past and current. This is where we're going. And you can see I'm an enthusiast for the study, of course, and I will naturally be so. But we really are, I believe, on a new wave here. So right now, you all know this, that in the 21st century, everyone's concerned about aging. Not so much aging, but the fact we're going to live longer and whether or not we're going to have a good life with those extra years. No point in living to 100 if the last 20 are crap, right? I don't want that. I'm sure you don't either. So we want to make sure that extended lifespan is also extended health span. How do you do that? Well, you need to understand the process of aging. All right, now, we understand a lot about aging, but mainly from non-human models. Right? It's really easy to follow a mouse's life because they die in a short space of time, and you can see them from beginning to end. But you know there's a lot of daylight between a mouse and a person. Right? There are real challenges extrapolating from animals to human beings, given the complexity of human beings. But hold on, why should we just limit our attention to that? Why should we be constrained? Why should we actually be wasting time there? Because aging, it is now recognised, is the ubiquitous risk factor for chronic diseases of the latter part of the life course. They're not the same. You can be aging, you don't have disease. They're not the same. And the strongest predictor of developing a whole bunch of non-communicable diseases, cancer, cardiovascular disease, dying of a stroke, diabetes and so forth, is aging. So surely you'd want to study aging before the horse is out the barn. You start to do it earlier, before people got old, right? In fact, the ideal design, and this comes straight out of NIH think tank, NIA, National Institute of Aging in America, is to do a study where you have a general population sample, well characterised, broadly, deep, from birth into midlife. And then, and this is a real kicker, they say, let's not do all the usual stuff, that physical antecedents. Let's focus our attention on the psychological and behavioural factors that are driving the ageing process. Guess what I've just described? Okay, so here's a conceptual model, just to flesh it out a bit. Old-fashioned thinking, this is life as we know it, is that you would live, do stuff, get disease, get sick, and die. It's a bit of a downer, isn't it? That sort of. Okay. Then we've got the newer version, and that really comes about by great people like David Barker, who in the 80s found that interesting things like low birth weight were related to the rates of cardiovascular disease in communities in England, and that led to a whole lot of research. And now it's basically, thank you. Now it's settled. Very early life factors can predict later life trajectories in terms of health and longevity. Okay, but this is a big hole here in what we know, right? So low birth weight, life, then disease, then drop dead. Okay? So we come in here. This is us. So what links that to that? There's this huge black box or lacuna in our understanding. And we are ideally positioned to begin to shed some light. So this is what we're studying, something called accelerated aging. We call it passive aging. And importantly, I can't go into this at the moment, but this is exciting stuff. We want to relate differences in passive aging in our 1,000 people to treatable conditions earlier in life. You can do something here, modify stuff here, that slows that. This will be less, quality of life will go up. All right? Now, what have we done in this space right now? We published a paper last year, and what we did was we take data from 18 markers or biomarkers that we've measured at age 26, age 32, and age 38. So we have a trajectory through time, 3 time points. Things we measured are there, right? All aspects of gums, telomere lengths. Telomeres are the little bits that sit on the end of chromosomes. As cells replicate, they shorten. Shorter telomeres means that your cells are aging at a faster rate until they senise. Lung function, cardiorespiratory fitness, a whole bunch of blood stuff, weight. You'll be familiar, that's lung function, lipids, that's diabetes vulnerability, and blood pressure. We've combined all that information, and we came up with a measure of pace of aging, because we're able to map the average across the cohort through those 3 time points. Then we mapped variability around that, and we found that certain people were on a faster or steeper decline in terms of aging on these variables. This is not a perfect list, by the way, it's just what we had available, but it's as good as anything in the world at the moment. What we found was that people, and this is the beauty of a cohort, a single year's cohort, people of the same age were biologically quite different. So the average was 38 biologically. There was a standard deviation of 3 and a bit, but some people, and this is the range, biologically, albeit 38 years old, looked like they're in the early 60s. Bad luck, eh? Some look much younger. I know what you're thinking. Where do I sit? I can tell you it'd be on the wrong end of the curve. That aside, we also checked that this made sense. So we have measures, remember, multidisciplinary database? We have measures of physical capability, and we found that people that were aging more rapidly were less physically able, both in terms of direct tests, grip strength, balance, fine motor control. They had worse or more significant IQ loss from childhood, because we measured that in childhood. Again, this acknowledged Phil, because Phil measured IQ in childhood in the 70s when it was very out of fashion. That's because of a guy called Arthur Jensen that was trotting down around the world saying that blacks are dumber than whites. So most people steered well clear of it because it was controversial. But Phil, because he was an educational psychologist, thought, no, this is a bloody important test, we're going to do it. That's the maverick. So we've got measures in childhood and now at 38. And these people who are aging faster have brains that are aging faster. They have measures via the eyeball, the retina of vascular health, because the eyeball's part of the brain on the outside, that are in bad shape. The ones with the worst eyeball microvasculature are aging the fastest. They say they're in worse health, and people, when they look at pictures of them, say they look older. This study is important because it allows people now to measure pace of aging in people who are not yet old. It was picked up, we didn't expect this of course, but it was voted to be the 4th most important science breakthrough of 2015 in the list of the top 25. So we're rather chuffed about that. And of course, it foreshadows a whole bunch of interesting findings. For example, we will measure pace of aging at phase 45. 4 data points, much more robust. We'll be able to go back in time and look at modifiable risk factors. We'll be able to look at gene environment, nature-nurture interplay in predicting who ages fast. Also, on the other side of the coin, we'll say, who ages well and why is that? Can that tell us something about who ages badly? We can look at the economic and social benefits that would justify intervening early to prevent this rapid aging trajectory, which of course will end up being, all other things being equal, the people that are aging badly in early midlife are the ones that will be going to the hospitals first, they'll be the ones in hospital for longest, and they'll be the biggest strain on resources. That's what we want to do. Of course, this was picked up internationally and people were sort of saying, cool, we've got a design that will enable us to test rejuvenation therapies. You've got to just roll with it, eh? Right, so that's some of the science, and I hope I've convinced you that what we do has relevance both to our colleagues, to practitioners, but also has interest and immediacy and high relevance to policymakers and politicians who are trying their very best to spend the taxpayer dollar in the wisest possible fashion. And we're just getting started. Now, this is another thing to draw your attention to say that we don't rest on our laurels and just do science and try and get it into policy discussions. We also try to disseminate to the people who pay for the study. That is the public. We come out of the public purse, and the Health Research Council has been our stalwart primary funder and its predecessor for 44 years. So thank you, HRC. I'm very proud of the HRC. I mean, I was a board member for, if it's the HRC, 25 years and a birthday. I've been a board member for a quarter of its existence. And you don't go up every month for 6 years without becoming very fond of the institution. And I'm so glad, thank you again to the incumbent government for injecting a decent amount of money to enable HRC to flourish. So here's us trying to do our bit to spread the word. And so there's been a TV program going on, or is going on currently, that a number of people seem to be enjoying, and that's lovely. But we also do other things. So this is one of the more novel attempts to get out to the public. There's a museum exhibition on the study, and it opened early this year. The first month, quite a few visits. They expect over 1/3 people to go through. And I've been down there a couple of times for various reasons. And I can see that people aren't filing through there like in school trips, just having to do it. There's people there that are fascinated by it. And I'm not surprised because the Toitu staff have done an incredible job of bringing to life faithfully different epochs, the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, and there are living rooms. You walk down a long corridor, there are living rooms from each of those epochs. And then on the left-hand side, there are study findings from those epochs. Beautifully done. If you're in Dunedin, look me up, shout you a cup of tea, and I'll take you down there. It's a wonderful thing. And I think it's interesting. This is one of the things that, yet again, the Dunedin study does just a little differently. This is a very important last slide. It's not the go to sleep slide, not a gratuitous. Why is that? Well, you get it, don't you? So they're the heroes. Thank you very much.
We have gone a little bit later than had been planned. That was my fault, not Richie's, but I'm quite sure there are a number of you that will have some questions, so we won't be offended if you need to go now. Bear in mind there is some presentations and some refreshments at the end of the presentation, but if there are any questions, we can take a few minutes now. Rodney's got a microphone, so we can let's go around.
Hello. In your early slide showing the number of people still involved in the study, it dropped to about 83% at one stage.
Yes.
How did you get it up again?
Through extra resourcing and focus and dedicated effort. The director who's sitting here made a special effort to play a very active role at Phase 15. There was a sense that, boy, this is not going the right direction, so everyone, Phil's nodding, pulled out all stops, and we drove it back up, as you saw. People have speculated as to why age 13 was low. I would attribute it largely to a resourcing challenge. It might be something to do with the age. 13-year-olds saying, oh, get stuffed, I'm not going to that silly thing. Who knows?
Thanks, Richie, for a lovely talk. Now, it's surprising to see that self-control is associated with so many different things related to health and some things not related to health. Mm-hmm. For that to be real, which I have no doubts about, what's the mechanism? Has there been any work done sort of identify why self-control is protective?
It's interesting, the question. I mean, I'll take you back to where this started. It was the observation that the early childhood interventions in the States in the 60s, things like Head Start, didn't have the effect they expected, because those were meant to be about driving up cognitive skills, school readiness, numeracy, literacy. Those effects, if they existed, were short-term, they faded out. But what they found was, when they followed their kids up many years later, is that these children had better school attendance. They weren't getting pregnant. They weren't as antisocial. And people began to speculate, well, something happened way back then that's having these long-term impacts in very positive ways on children. What is it? And people, depending on the disciplinary background, all converged on this idea about it being some impact upon non-cognitive skills, in particular this ability to regulate emotion and to persist, which developmental psychologists call self-control. If you're writing a popular book to make a few bucks, you might call willpower. If you're a neuroscientist, you might call frontal lobe function. So everyone's converging on this same point through different pathways. So the underlying neural substrate of that is stuff that relates to the ability to executive control function, to observe, to sort, to inhibit, to move forward when appropriate. So it's a biological substrate, but of course it's a learned skill. It's like any other skill. It's like being good at hockey or basketball. That's the great news, you can learn it. And there's no point in the life course where you don't benefit from learning it. So to be self-deprecating for a second, I've got a lot of self-control, but it's finite, and it's finite for everyone. It's like a muscle. If you use it a lot, it'll get stronger, but it's finite. So I use all my self-control up doing the work I've got to do. 10 o'clock at night, cruising past the fridge at home. It's all gone at that witching hour. All right, so I could do with some more. The means to which you acquire this skill are not mysterious, as I said. This is the good news. There's no magic bullet, right? So that's a nonsense. But if you had to pick one thing that is likely to return across multiple important, significant, costly domains, this might be it, or at least you start with this. So this is like the, who's heard of the marshmallow test? This is the grown-up version of that. That's the same thing. Who's seen those videotapes of those kids? Aren't they glorious? You know, I would have eaten a marshmallow.
Richie, talk us through how generalizable these results are. Do they work in Africa? Do they work in Asia? And I guess, and the other thing that I'm really delighted to see is you're working across New Zealand now. And to what extent will that continue, and what do you need to be able to keep doing that?
So the generalizability is a good question. I think the safe thing to say right now is it's generalizable, the data is generalizable to similar jurisdictions. So, countries that have a similar lifestyle, similar judicial system, similar political system. So, testament to that, we have been lucky enough to receive money from the National Institutes of Health. Now, they don't give us money because they're nice and friendly and generous. Well, they may be, but it's not the reason they give it to us. They give it to us because, I'm quite proud of this, with America in mind, is that this is the only place they can get their questions answered, this study. And we have to sign a declaration on the back of empirical proof that this cannot be done in America, so the money has to go offshore. America used to have a lot of money. It's got no money like everyone else now. So we're taking money out of the mouths, hands, whatever, bank accounts of American researchers. So they know it's generalizable because we've done cross-country validation. So we take similar not the same cohort, but a cohort where we can ask the same questions to the same developmental point and compare results, and on many things we look the same. So that's the empirical case as to why we can generalise to the States. Same with MRC in the UK. So they've funded us for the last 2 assessment phases. It's 32 and 38, and they do that because they believe it's generalisable to their jurisdiction. One reviewer last time round actually summed it up beautifully and said, we should give this mob, it was about £250,000, we should give them that because it would take us 40 years and cost 50 million quid to do the same thing. I wouldn't have a clue, and I would doubt very much it would generalise to issues that were sensitive to social process and macro context in Africa or Asia. But I would say that the basic findings about whether you maltreat children, whether you expose yourself to cigarette smoke and use substances, probably are universal. These other factors will moderate, but you can get some basic patterns and developmental pathways that would probably be robust, at least a point to start. The second part of the question was about New Zealand. We're very keen to, as much as we can, honouring our contract with our study members, to expand the study access to New Zealanders in particular. So we're an international consortium, have been for a long time. I mean, it always amazes me when people kind of think, really, are you? I mean, we've been getting money from America since phase 13, what's that? That's 30 years. But within New Zealand, I would like to see a lot more people access the data according to our rules, which are those that we have contracted with our study members to uphold. The rules are not draconian. You just got to have a good idea. It can't be already contracted for, so it can't be something that someone's already been paid for from a funding agency to test. We've got to have the data that can enable a strong test of the hypothesis. We don't want weak stuff messing up, muddying up the literature. And there has to be a available theme leader to support, supervise, because these people have a lifetime investment. They know how the data works. They know how the variables are constructed, the whys, the wherefores, so that ensures good science. It's interesting. And can someone explain this to me? I've been saying this for 5 years. No, when did I come? I came back from sabbatical in 2013 and started saying this. And I expected to be flooded with inquiries. People love the idea of it and people don't turn up. It's not my responsibility to be more proactive than I am. I've got too much to do already. I don't know, do people think I'm a liar? I don't think so. Are they intimidated by what's there? I don't know. The misperception about the Dunedin study, of course, is it's like a lolly shop. You just get involved and good things happen. Couldn't be further from the truth. A hell of a lot of hard work goes into, in particular, reframing data to make it of contemporary relevance. So I'm very keen, as I say, and I think the first really potentially exciting development in this regard is that I'm a member of a core, a brain core, that's headed by Cliff Abraham from our university and Richard Fall from Auckland. And we've become part of that. And we will be doing, I haven't mentioned this tonight, but we're going to do for the first time MRIs, brain scans, neuroimaging on the study. That's $4 million of US money that wants to invest in our cohort, because they don't have a resource that they can tap into that will tell them about normative human behaviour, normal human brain development, I should say, in a really well characterised cohort. Most of their investments are in small samples or older people with diseases, where diseases have affected the brain. So they've invested in us. And the quid pro quo for me with my US collaborators is that all the people that sail in the core ship, the brain core, will get to access if they can see good ideas to test. So that's a really attractive option to me because it's controlled. I know Richard and Cliff well and trust them. I know that my colleagues, I've met them a number of times now within the core, which was a new world to me, this heavy-duty brain science. They are great, and so that'll be one way we can push further into developing New Zealand careers, developing New Zealand science, and positioning ourselves well in this new space. What will make all the difference, of course, is funding. And did I say something before? I said, I'm extremely optimistic. Something's under embargo? No, I didn't say that, did I?
One last question.
Ken Owens, my name. 3 very quick things. We get vicarious pleasure and benefit out of your presentation. I'm one that's so proud to be a graduate of the university, and it's presentations like this that do it. Second point, I just want to say thank you for your user-friendly presentation. It's a classic example of taking academia into the real world and the marketplace. Third thing, which is the question. I think there's a real interest in the user-friendly world now in the issues, which brings me just to one question of language. Self-control, which is one of the key factors we've been talking about tonight, has almost a moral category about it. It says you're bad if you don't have self-control. It says at 5 years of age you must have done something wrong. And I've just got a bit of a query. Has there been some energy put into actually the language and the categorising, especially because we're now going out into a world that is really interested along that way? You in passing used the term willpower. That would be a personal preference, but I've not even thought about it.
Thank you for the first 2 comments, and I think your question is a very good one. I agree the power of language and how you frame things is very important. On the other hand, I'm a believer in plain speaking. Call something what it is. If a child's been traumatised, you call it trauma. In this case, I think it's moot as to whether that's the best terminology. It's just what has been used over time. I'd be sanguine about whatever the term is, so long as we're talking about the same thing. And I agree that it has certain overtones or connotations that are pejorative. I do my very best to explain that it's agnostic. It's just a term that describes a set of behaviours and propensities. I mean, there are different ways of conceiving of it, or basically describing, I should say, within science. 6 or 7 different terms that people will use, which adds to confusion actually, where people from different disciplines talk past each other at times. I will take that as my predecessor once, or more than once, famously said, under advisement.
Ken, I think the second point you made about taking academia into the real world was very apt, and Richie used the term social investment a couple of times. It's been a term that the government has also used to describe the sorts of things it wants to do in terms of investing up front. We politicians aren't generally regarded for taking a long-term view. Often the criticism is that funding cycles follow political cycles or electoral cycles, but Bill English is leading a group of ministers, and I was a part of that as Minister of Police, within the social sector group that are grappling with the very sorts of issues that Richie has described. And it is hard. It's really, really difficult. But one of the things that we need is good data. And I think what we have heard tonight is the best example of where good data can be used for better decision making. And I know that people are listening very carefully to what Richie has to say, and the whole team. And I think we can be incredibly proud of the work that's being done on our behalf by Richie, started by Dr. Silva so many years ago, and which will have benefit well into the future. So on your behalf, please join me in thanking Professor Richie Poulton.